In the summer of 1903, construction workers breaking ground for a new railroad depot in the remote hills of southeastern Utah made a discovery that would haunt local authorities for decades to come. What they initially mistook for a natural cave opening beneath the foundation of an abandoned homestead revealed itself to be something far more deliberate and deeply disturbing. The workers had stumbled upon a carefully constructed underground chamber, its walls lined with rough-hewn timber, and its floor scattered with the remnants of 11 distinct sleeping areas. Each space bore evidence of prolonged human habitation, yet the circumstances of this discovery would challenge everything the local community thought they knew about the isolated religious settlement that had operated there just 5 years earlier. The homestead above had belonged to Sister Mercy Whitmore, a woman whose name appeared in territorial records as both the legal wife of Elder Joshua Whitmore and as the registered owner of nearly 200 acres of apparently worthless scrubland. What made Sister Mercy's property particularly unusual was not its size, but rather the pattern of male visitors documented by territorial tax assessors and traveling postal workers throughout the late 1890s. These men, ranging in age from their early 20s to their mid-40s, would arrive at the property individually and on foot, often carrying nothing more than small cloth bundles. According to the detailed observations of Territorial Supervisor Edmund Blackwood, whose quarterly inspection reports have been preserved in the Utah State Archives, these visitors would disappear into the property for weeks or even months at a time, with no evidence of their departure ever being recorded. The construction foreman, a methodical German immigrant named Klaus Brenner, maintained detailed daily logs of the excavation work that would later prove invaluable to territorial investigators. Brenner's meticulous documentation reveals that the underground chamber measured approximately 30 feet in length and 20 feet in width, with a ceiling height of just over 7 feet at its center. The space had been carved directly into the sandstone bedrock and reinforced with thick wooden support beams that showed clear signs of professional carpentry work. Most disturbing of all, Brenner's crew discovered that each of the 11 sleeping areas had been equipped with heavy iron rings embedded directly into the stone walls, positioned at heights that suggested they were intended to restrain someone lying down. The territorial investigation that followed would uncover a web of carefully maintained deceptions that had allowed Sister Mercy's operation to continue undetected for nearly a decade. Elder Joshua Whitmore, it emerged, had died of pneumonia in 1894, 3 full years before the first documented male visitors began arriving at his widow's remote property. Sister Mercy had continued to collect her deceased husband's territorial pension by forging his signature on quarterly collection forms, a practice that territorial records show continued uninterrupted until the spring of 1902. This financial deception had provided her with both the resources and the legal cover necessary to maintain her isolated compound without drawing unwanted attention from local religious or civil authorities. The most chilling evidence of Sister Mercy's true activities came from a cache of personal correspondence discovered hidden beneath loose floorboards in the main cabin's root cellar. These letters, written in Sister Mercy's careful handwriting, detailed arrangements with what she referred to as breeding partners throughout the Utah Territory and beyond. The correspondence reveals a sophisticated network of communication that extended into Colorado, Nevada, and even as far east as Missouri, with Sister Mercy offering specific assurances about discretion, accommodation, and what she cryptically described as guaranteed productive outcomes. The letters make repeated references to her property as a sacred sanctuary for the propagation of righteous bloodlines, language that suggested deep familiarity with fundamentalist Mormon theology while simultaneously perverting its core principles. Territorial investigators working under the direction of Inspector General William Crawford spent months attempting to trace the identities of the men who had visited Sister Mercy's property. Their investigation revealed that she had been remarkably selective in her recruitment, targeting specifically those men who were traveling alone, had no immediate family connections in the territory, and possessed what her letters described as superior physical and moral characteristics. Many of these men had been recruited from wagon trains passing through Salt Lake City, where Sister Mercy would apparently approach them with offers of temporary work and lodging before persuading them to accompany her to her remote property. The isolation of her compound, located more than 30 miles from the nearest settlement and accessible only by a barely marked trail through difficult mountain terrain, ensured that any man who accepted her invitation would find himself completely cut off from the outside world. The physical evidence discovered in the underground chamber painted a deeply disturbing picture of the conditions these men had endured during their captivity. Territorial medical examiner Dr. Harrison Polk documented the presence of numerous iron implements whose purpose remained unclear, along with what appeared to be a sophisticated system of rope and pulley mechanisms attached to the ceiling beams. Most troubling of all, Dr. Polk's examination revealed clear evidence of long-term human habitation in conditions that suggested severe overcrowding and inadequate sanitation. The chamber's single entrance, accessed through a concealed trapdoor in the main cabin's floor, had been equipped with multiple heavy locks that could only be operated from above, making escape virtually impossible for anyone confined below. The discovery of Sister Mercy's detailed journals provided investigators with an unprecedented window into her psychological state and the gradual development of her elaborate scheme. Written in a mixture of religious terminology and clinical medical observations, these journals reveal a woman whose initial grief over her husband's death had gradually transformed into an obsessive belief that she had been chosen by divine providence to ensure the continuation of what she called genetically superior bloodlines. Her entries describe a complex breeding program designed to produce children who would, in her words, carry forward the physical and spiritual perfection necessary for the coming millennium. The journals make clear that Sister Mercy viewed herself not as a criminal, but as a faithful servant carrying out sacred work that required her to make tremendous personal sacrifices. The territorial investigation faced significant challenges in determining exactly what had happened to the 11 men whose presence in the underground chamber was so clearly documented. Sister Mercy herself had vanished without a trace sometime in early 1902, leaving behind only her detailed journals and the carefully maintained records of her breeding program. Local authorities conducted extensive searches of the surrounding wilderness, but the harsh terrain and extreme weather conditions made comprehensive exploration virtually impossible. More troubling still, the territorial records showed no documented instances of any of the recruited men ever returning to their home communities or attempting to contact family members in the years following their disappearance. The fate of any children who might have resulted from Sister Mercy's breeding program remained an equally disturbing mystery. Her journals contained detailed records of multiple pregnancies, along with careful documentation of birth dates, physical characteristics, and what she described as developmental milestones for dozens of infants born between 1897 and 1901. However, territorial investigators could find no evidence of these children in local birth records, territorial census data, or adoption registries. Sister Mercy's journals suggested that she had developed an extensive network of placement families throughout the Western Territories, but her use of coded language and deliberately vague geographical references made it impossible to trace any specific children to their ultimate destinations. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Sister Mercy had manipulated local religious and civil authorities to maintain the secrecy of her operation. Territorial records show that she had cultivated relationships with several prominent church elders by making regular and substantial donations to local building funds and missionary programs. These contributions, funded through her fraudulent collection of her deceased husband's pension, as well as fees charged to visiting men, had earned her a reputation as a devout and financially generous widow whose privacy deserved to be respected. Local church leaders had actively discouraged territorial officials from conducting routine inspections of her property, arguing that such intrusions would be inappropriate given her status as a grieving widow living alone in accordance with religious principles. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the territorial investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that Sister Mercy's operation had not been entirely unique. Scattered references in her correspondence pointed to similar establishments operated by other widowed women throughout the remote areas of Utah Territory, all apparently connected through a loose network of shared resources and mutual protection. These references were deliberately cryptic, but territorial investigators found enough corroborating evidence to suggest that Sister Mercy's breeding program had been part of a larger and more sophisticated criminal conspiracy than anyone had initially realized. The scope of this network, and the number of missing men who might have fallen victim to similar schemes, represented a law enforcement challenge that territorial authorities felt ill-equipped to address. The legal proceedings that followed the discovery of Sister Mercy's compound were hampered by the complete absence of the primary suspect and the lack of any surviving victims who could provide testimony about their experiences. Territorial prosecutors found themselves in the unprecedented position of attempting to build a case around physical evidence and documentary materials without any living witnesses to the crimes that had clearly been committed. The isolation of Sister Mercy's property, combined with the sophisticated nature of her deception and the complicity of local religious authorities, had created what territorial investigators described as a perfect storm of circumstances that allowed unthinkable crimes to continue undetected for years. The abandoned homestead was eventually demolished by territorial order, with the underground chamber sealed using dynamite and concrete to prevent its ever being used again. However, local residents reported strange occurrences around the property site for decades afterward, including unexplained sounds emanating from beneath the ground and the discovery of personal belongings that appeared to belong to missing persons from throughout the region. These reports, documented in territorial files that remained classified until the 1960s, suggested that the full scope of Sister Mercy's crimes might never be fully understood or properly investigated. The case of Sister Mercy Whitmore and her breeding cabin would eventually become the subject of intense academic study by criminologists and historians specializing in frontier-era crime. Dr. Margaret Thornfield of the University of Utah, whose definitive research on the case was published in 1987, argued that Sister Mercy's operation represented one of the most sophisticated examples of serial criminal enterprise in 19th century America. Dr. Thornfield's analysis of the surviving evidence suggested that Sister Mercy had likely been responsible for the disappearances of far more than 11 men, and that her breeding program had operated with a level of planning and methodical execution that challenged contemporary assumptions about the criminal capabilities of women in that era. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Thornfield's research painted Sister Mercy as a highly intelligent individual whose religious delusions had provided her with both the motivation and the moral justification necessary to carry out her elaborate scheme. Her journals revealed someone who genuinely believed that her actions were not only morally acceptable, but actually required by divine command. This combination of criminal sophistication and religious fanaticism, Dr. Thornfield argued, made Sister Mercy's case particularly significant for understanding how seemingly ordinary individuals could be capable of committing extraordinarily heinous crimes when provided with the right combination of opportunity, isolation, and ideological justification. The territorial records documenting the investigation into Sister Mercy's compound were eventually transferred to federal custody following Utah's statehood in 1896, where they remained classified as part of ongoing criminal investigations until the mid-20th century. When these records were finally made available to researchers, they revealed the extent to which territorial and early state authorities had struggled to comprehend the scope and nature of Sister Mercy's crimes. The case had challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, religion, and criminal behavior in ways that law enforcement officials of the era found deeply unsettling and difficult to process. Modern forensic analysis of the physical evidence preserved from Sister Mercy's compound has provided additional insights into the conditions that the captive men endured during their imprisonment. Soil samples taken from the underground chamber revealed traces of human remains that suggested at least some of the missing men had died while confined beneath the cabin. However, the advanced decomposition of any organic material and the extensive contamination of the site made it impossible to determine specific causes of death or to positively identify individual victims. This forensic evidence, while disturbing, provided investigators with confirmation that Sister Mercy's breeding program had indeed resulted in multiple deaths, even if the exact circumstances remained unclear. The legacy of Sister Mercy's crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims who suffered at her remote compound. The case highlighted fundamental weaknesses in 19th century law enforcement and civil administration that allowed sophisticated criminal enterprises to operate undetected in frontier communities. The isolation that characterized much of the American West during this period created opportunities for individuals like Sister Mercy to exploit vulnerable populations while maintaining elaborate deceptions that could continue for years without detection. These systemic vulnerabilities would eventually lead to significant reforms in territorial law enforcement and the establishment of improved communication networks designed to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. The personal belongings discovered throughout Sister Mercy's compound provided investigators with haunting glimpses into the lives of her victims before their disappearance. Among the most disturbing finds were 11 distinct sets of clothing, each carefully folded and stored in individual wooden crates within a secondary chamber adjacent to the main underground facility. These garments, ranging from the rough work clothes of manual laborers to the more refined attire of traveling merchants and clerks, had been meticulously cataloged by Sister Mercy herself. Each crate bore a handwritten label containing what appeared to be the victim's name, approximate age, place of origin, and a series of coded notations whose meaning territorial investigators were never able to decipher completely. The clothing analysis conducted by territorial investigators revealed disturbing patterns in Sister Mercy's victim selection process. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a physician contracted by territorial authorities to examine the physical evidence, noted that the garments consistently belonged to men of above-average height and robust physical build. The quality of dental work evident in personal hygiene items found alongside the clothing suggested that Sister Mercy had specifically targeted men from relatively prosperous backgrounds who would have had access to better nutrition and medical care during their formative years. This selective breeding philosophy, as outlined in her journals, reflected a sophisticated understanding of hereditary traits that was remarkably advanced for someone operating in the remote Utah territory during the 1890s. The discovery of Sister Mercy's detailed breeding charts provided investigators with unprecedented insight into the scientific methodology behind her criminal enterprise. These hand-drawn diagrams, executed with the precision of a trained botanist or animal husbandry specialist, track genetic characteristics across multiple generations of her intended offspring. Each chart identified specific physical and intellectual traits that Sister Mercy considered desirable, including height, eye color, hair texture, and what she described as cognitive capability indicators. The charts also revealed her systematic approach to pairing captive men with herself based on complementary genetic characteristics, suggesting a level of biological understanding that far exceeded what would have been typical for a frontier woman of that era. The territorial investigation uncovered evidence that Sister Mercy had maintained extensive correspondence with medical professionals throughout the Western Territories, seeking advice on topics ranging from nutrition during pregnancy to techniques for ensuring successful conception. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, one of the few female physicians practicing in Utah Territory during the 1890s, later testified that she had unknowingly provided Sister Mercy with detailed information about prenatal care and childbirth procedures through a series of letters spanning several years. Dr. Morrison's correspondence, preserved in territorial archives, reveals that Sister Mercy had presented herself as the wife of a remote rancher, seeking medical guidance for herself and other women in her isolated religious community. The sophisticated nature of Sister Mercy's medical inquiries, combined with her apparent understanding of reproductive physiology, suggested preparation and planning that extended back years before the first documented disappearances began. The financial records discovered in Sister Mercy's cabin painted a picture of an operation that generated substantial profits through multiple revenue streams beyond the fraudulent collection of her deceased husband's pension. Detailed account ledgers revealed that she had charged each visiting man significant fees for what she described as sanctuary accommodations and spiritual guidance. These payments, typically collected in advance and often representing the men's entire life savings, provided Sister Mercy with the resources necessary to maintain her compound and fund the expansion of her underground facilities. The ledgers also documented regular payments to individuals identified only by initials, suggesting a network of accomplices who received compensation for their role in recruiting victims or maintaining the secrecy of her operation. Perhaps most chilling of all, the territorial investigation uncovered evidence that Sister Mercy had been systematically drugging her captive victims to maintain control over them during their extended imprisonment. Chemical analysis of residue found in cooking utensils and water containers throughout the compound revealed traces of laudanum and other opiate derivatives that would have rendered the men docile and dependent while gradually undermining their physical strength and mental clarity. Dr. Harrison Polk's examination of the underground chamber identified what appeared to be a sophisticated ventilation system designed to concentrate these chemical vapors in the confined space, creating an environment where even strong and determined men would have found resistance increasingly difficult as their captivity continued. The investigation also revealed that Sister Mercy had maintained detailed medical records for each of her captive victims, documenting their physical condition, dietary intake, and reproductive potential with the methodical precision of a livestock breeder. These records, written in a combination of medical terminology and religious language, describe the men in dehumanizing terms that emphasize their biological functions, while completely ignoring their individual identities or personal histories. The records included detailed measurements of physical characteristics, assessments of genetic quality, and projections of breeding potential that treated the captive men as nothing more than biological resources to be exploited for Sister Mercy's reproductive goals. The Territorial Postal Service provided investigators with additional evidence of the scope of Sister Mercy's criminal network through an analysis of mail delivery records for her remote property. Postal Supervisor James Whitfield testified that Sister Mercy had received an unusually high volume of correspondence from throughout the Western Territories and beyond, with letters arriving from locations as distant as Chicago, New Orleans, and even several major European cities. The international nature of some of this correspondence suggested that Sister Mercy's recruitment network extended far beyond the American frontier, possibly connecting with similar criminal enterprises operating in other countries where law enforcement coordination was virtually non-existent. The discovery of a hidden workshop beneath Sister Mercy's main cabin revealed the extent to which she had prepared for the long-term operation of her breeding program. This secondary underground facility contains sophisticated woodworking and metalworking equipment that had been used to construct the restraint systems and containment mechanisms found throughout the compound. The workshop also housed an extensive library of medical and scientific texts, including several volumes on genetics, reproductive physiology, and animal husbandry that would have been extremely difficult to obtain in the remote Utah territory. The presence of these specialized resources suggested that Sister Mercy had been planning and preparing for her criminal enterprise for many years before putting it into operation. The Territorial Investigation Team, led by Inspector General William Crawford, faced unprecedented challenges in documenting and preserving evidence from Sister Mercy's compound. The remote location of the property, combined with harsh weather conditions and difficult terrain, made transportation of materials and personnel extremely challenging. Crawford's detailed reports describe a crime scene unlike anything in territorial law enforcement experience, requiring specialized equipment and expertise that simply did not exist within the territorial government's resources. The investigation team was forced to improvise preservation techniques and documentation methods while working under severe time constraints imposed by approaching winter weather that threatened to make the site completely inaccessible for months. The psychological evaluation of Sister Mercy's written materials provided investigators with disturbing insights into the mental state of a woman who had systematically dehumanized and exploited dozens of victims over nearly a decade. Dr. Cornelius Webb, a physician with specialized training in mental disorders, analyzed Sister Mercy's journals and correspondence for evidence of psychological abnormalities that might explain her criminal behavior. Dr. Webb's findings, preserved in territorial medical archives, described a complex psychological profile combining religious fanaticism, narcissistic delusions of divine selection, and a complete absence of empathy for her victims that enabled her to treat human beings as nothing more than breeding stock for her reproductive experiments. The territorial investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting that Sister Mercy had been influenced by emerging theories about genetic improvement and racial purity that were beginning to circulate among certain intellectual communities during the late 19th century. Her journals contained references to scientific articles and books that promoted the idea of selective breeding as a means of improving human populations, concepts that would later evolve into the eugenics movement of the early 20th century. Sister Mercy's criminal enterprise represented one of the earliest documented attempts to put these theories into practice on a systematic scale, making her case significant not only as a criminal investigation, but also as an example of how pseudoscientific ideas could be used to justify horrific acts of violence and exploitation. The fate of Sister Mercy's biological children remained one of the most troubling, unresolved aspects of the entire investigation. Her detailed journals documented the births of more than 30 infants between 1897 and 1901, along with careful records of their physical development, health status, and placement with what she described as worthy families throughout the Western territories. However, territorial investigators could find no trace of any of these children in adoption records, census data, or church registries anywhere in the region. The complete absence of any documentation for these children suggested either that Sister Mercy's network of placement families operated entirely outside legal channels, or that the fate of these infants had been far darker than her journals indicated. The investigation revealed that Sister Mercy had maintained correspondence with several prominent figures in the early Mormon fundamentalist movement, including individuals who would later be identified as leaders of polygamous communities throughout Utah Territory. These letters, written in coded language that referenced sacred bloodlines and divine breeding obligations, suggested that Sister Mercy's criminal enterprise may have been connected to broader religious movements that emphasized genetic purity and selective reproduction. The involvement of religious authorities in facilitating or protecting Sister Mercy's operation raised disturbing questions about the extent to which extremist religious beliefs had enabled and concealed serious criminal activity throughout the territory. The territorial medical examiner's analysis of the underground chamber revealed evidence of systematic malnutrition and physical abuse that painted a horrific picture of the conditions endured by Sister Mercy's captive victims. Soil samples from the chamber floor contained traces of human blood and tissue that suggested regular physical violence, while chemical analysis of water sources revealed evidence of deliberate contamination with substances that would have caused chronic illness and physical weakness. The combination of poor nutrition, chemical poisoning, and physical restraint created conditions that would have made escape virtually impossible even for healthy and determined men, while gradually undermining their ability to resist Sister Mercy's control over their reproductive functions. The discovery of Sister Mercy's extensive photographic collection provided investigators with visual documentation of her criminal activities that proved both valuable as evidence and deeply disturbing to examine. These photographs, taken with sophisticated camera equipment that would have been expensive and difficult to obtain in the remote Utah Territory, showed various stages of her breeding program, including images of captive men, pregnant women who appeared to be Sister Mercy herself, and infants whose fates remained unknown. The technical quality of these photographs suggested either that Sister Mercy possessed advanced photographic skills or that she had access to professional assistance in documenting her activities, raising additional questions about the scope of her criminal network. The territorial investigation team's attempts to trace Sister Mercy's background and origins revealed a woman whose personal history was as mysterious as her criminal activities. Territorial records contained conflicting information about her birthplace, family background, and education, with some documents suggesting she had been born in Missouri, while others indicated origins in Illinois or even Pennsylvania. The only consistent element in these conflicting accounts was her marriage to Elder Joshua Whitmore in 1888, but even this event was documented in church records that later proved to have been falsified. The deliberate obscuring of Sister Mercy's personal history suggested sophisticated long-term planning that extended back years before the beginning of her documented criminal activities. The story of Sister Mercy Whitmore's breeding cabin serves as a chilling reminder of how religious extremism, social isolation, and criminal opportunity can combine to create conditions in which unthinkable horrors can flourish undetected. Her ability to maintain her elaborate deception for nearly a decade while systematically victimizing numerous men reveals the extent to which frontier communities could be manipulated by individuals who understood how to exploit their social and institutional weaknesses. The 11 men whose sleeping areas were discovered in that underground chamber represent not only the documented victims of her crimes, but also the broader vulnerability of isolated populations to predatory individuals who operate outside the boundaries of conventional society. The sophisticated nature of her operation, combining elements of religious manipulation, scientific methodology, and systematic violence, created a criminal enterprise unlike anything in documented American history. The investigation into Sister Mercy's compound ultimately raised more questions than it answered, leaving law enforcement officials and later researchers with a case study in criminal behavior that continues to defy complete understanding. The sophisticated nature of her operation, the extensive network of accomplices and placement families that her journal suggested, and the complete disappearance of both Sister Mercy herself and any children produced through her breeding program created a web of unresolved mysteries that may never be fully solved. The physical evidence of her crimes remains sealed beneath tons of concrete and stone, but the psychological impact of her story continues to resonate with anyone who examines the darker possibilities of human behavior when unchecked by social oversight and moral restraint. The case stands as a testament to the capacity for evil that can emerge when isolation, fanaticism, and opportunity converge in the absence of effective law enforcement and social accountability.